Hello, neighbors. Before we get into the episode, just a couple quick things I'd like to mention. If you go to the podcast website, neighborontheleft.com, there's a whole bunch of things for you to check out there, including the contacts page, where you can see all of the social media links. And these days, I do post a lot of stuff just about daily on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. A lot of interesting stuff there. If you stop by, please like, share, and follow if you would. Also on the website, there is the episodes section where you can download or stream any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the beginning. And of course, the blog section. I make a post for every episode of the podcast, and it includes all of the sources that I use. All right, let's start the episode. So a couple of days ago, I was scrolling through social media, as I do way too much of, and I came across one of those AI animated, quote-unquote, history reels. I'm sure you know the kind. Dramatic narration, shadowy rooms, powerful people speaking in hushed voices, everybody looking sinister. Everybody knows something, and within about 30 seconds, you're thinking to yourself, good God, how have I never heard about this? This one was about something called the Franklin cover-up. And according to the video, back in the late 1980s, a politically connected businessman in Omaha was running a massive financial fraud while also operating a child sex trafficking network that supplied vulnerable kids to wealthy and powerful people. Politicians, businessmen, people in law enforcement, and eventually, according to the story, the trail went all the way to Washington. This wasn't just some local businessman whose name got dragged into politics after the fact. Larry King had real connections inside Republican politics, national party roles, inaugural activities, relationships with elected officials, and some of the later allegations would reach all the way up into the Reagan and Bush political orbit. That's why this isn't just a true crime story from Omaha. It became a story about political access, institutional power, and whether influential people were being protected. The animation even opened with Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Then came investigators supposedly being threatened, and witnesses supposedly being silenced, and evidence supposedly disappearing, an investigator dying in a plane crash with his 8-year-old son, and ultimately the whole thing being buried. And my reaction was, quite honestly, what the hell is this? Because even if half the story is true, we're talking about one of the ugliest political scandals in modern American history. And I had never heard of it. So I started looking, and almost immediately I discovered something I wasn't expecting. There really was a Franklin scandal. There really was a politically connected man named Larry King. There really was a credit union with tens of millions of dollars missing. There really were allegations that minors had been exploited by powerful adults. Nebraska legislators really did investigate the allegations, and an investigator working for that legislative committee really did die in a plane crash. Those parts are not internet mythology. But then, you keep digging, and you discover that state and federal investigations rejected broader allegations. A grand jury called the story a, quote, carefully crafted hoax. One of the principal accusers was convicted of perjury. Some of the claims become increasingly extraordinary. There's things like satanic rituals and CIA operations and murder and connections to Iran-Contra, a nationwide network, and suddenly you've got two completely different stories sort of sitting on top of each other. One says political people sexually exploited vulnerable kids and the system protected them, and the other says investigators chased a collection of lies and rumors and increasingly elaborate fantasies until they became a conspiracy theory that refuses to die. And here's the problem. once you actually start looking at the record, neither version is quite as simple as it sounds. So today, we're going to do something that I don't often do on this podcast. We're going to go down the rabbit hole, but we're bringing receipts. Hello, neighbors. You're listening to a Friday edition of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left, a podcast about progressive politics, human decency, and a life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. As always, I am your host. My name is Don Spielis. And today we're doing something a little bit different. Usually on the Friday episodes of Back Porch Files, I'm taking something happening right now and pulling it apart. This time, we're going back almost 40 years. And I'm not coming into this episode trying to prove there was some enormous government conspiracy. And I'm also not coming into it assuming that because somebody stamped hoax across the official report, that it settles every question. We're going to treat this like I treated it when I first stumbled across it. Start at the beginning, figure out what actually happened, figure out what people said happened, talk about what investigators found, and then, and only then, decide what we're justified in believing. Because this story gets strange. It gets dark, and at certain points, it gets downright unbelievable. But before we get anywhere near secret networks and Washington connections and dead investigators and alleged cover-ups, we need to start with something much less mysterious. Money. A whole hell of a lot of missing money. And a man named Lawrence E. King Jr. So, Lawrence E. King Jr. was not some anonymous guy running a little neighborhood credit union who suddenly found himself at the center of a national scandal. By the 1980s, Larry King, as we'll call him throughout this, Larry King was somebody. Not president of the United States somebody, but definitely somebody who had learned how to move comfortably in rooms full of people who really mattered. King had taken over the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union in Omaha in 1970. Franklin had been created to provide financial services in largely black neighborhoods that were not always well served, particularly well, by traditional banks. And King was good at selling the mission. He cultivated Omaha's business community. He persuaded charities and nonprofits to put money into Franklin. He became visible in civic organizations. And politically, well, King was a Republican. And more than that, he became active nationally in black Republican politics. He served as vice chairman for finance for the National Black Republican Council, which was affiliated with the Republican National Committee. And here's where I want to stop for just a second, because this is our first opportunity to separate something real from something that gets inflated later. Larry King's political connections were real. I found that in 1985, there's a document from 1985 in the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in which two Nebraska congressmen were recommending King for a presidential appointment. And they weren't describing some random donor they'd met once at a rubber chicken dinner. They wrote that King was vice chairman for finance of the National Black Republican Council, that he'd served on the advisory committee for Reagan's second inauguration, helped plan the Black Republican inaugural gala, and was involved in developing Republican political strategy. So when somebody tells you Larry King had access to Republican circles, he did, definitely. That much is documented. What that does not mean is that Ronald Reagan knew Larry King was allegedly abusing children. It doesn't mean that George H.W. Bush knew. It certainly doesn't mean Reagan and Bush were sitting around having sinister conversations about how to protect some secret trafficking network, despite what this animated video I saw would very much like you to believe. Access is access. A political relationship is a political relationship. Neither one is evidence of participation in a crime. So keep that distinction in your pocket, because we're going to need it again. Now, while King was building this public image, successful businessman, civic leader, Republican mover and shaker, he was also living like a man with access to a completely different level of money. And I mean living. Contemporary reporting described expensive hotels and extensive travel, luxury purchases, lavish spending. The Washington Post reported that when King went to Los Angeles, he favored a 2-story suite at the Beverly Wilshire. In Washington, he was paying thousands of dollars a month for a residence near Embassy Row. And there were expensive clothes and furniture and cars and trips. A story about a $23,000 crystal chandelier. And Franklin Community Federal Credit Union was not like JP Morgan Chase. This was a relatively small community credit union in Omaha, Nebraska. So eventually, somebody was going to ask the obvious question: where the hell is all this money coming from? In November of 1988, Franklin collapsed, and when Nebraska lawmakers responded, the numbers were already staggering. A legislative resolution adopted that month described the potential improper taking of more than $30 million. Think about that. More than $30 million from a community credit union in 1988. The legislature ordered an investigation into what had happened, how it happened, who was responsible, and whether public officials or regulators had failed somehow along the way. And the financial investigation would eventually establish that this wasn't just sloppy bookkeeping or a credit union that made bad loans. This was enormous financial misconduct. King eventually pleaded guilty in federal court and received 15 years in prison. So, before we even get to the part about the children, before we talk about the powerful businessmen, before anybody starts talking about Reagan and Bush and CIA and Satanism and cover-ups and murder, understand this. The Franklin scandal was real. There was real money missing. There was a real federal criminal case. There was real politically connected person at the center of it. And if the story ended there, Larry King would still be remembered as a central figure in one of the strangest financial scandals Omaha had ever seen. But the story didn't end there. Because as investigators started pulling at the financial threads around Franklin, they began hearing something else. And what they began hearing was a heck of a lot darker than stolen money. This is the point where the Franklin case changes, because the questions are no longer just where did the money go and who signed what and who failed to notice. Now, young people begin making allegations of sexual abuse. And before I tell you what they said, there's something important about who some of these young people were. Several had histories involving foster care, juvenile services, Boys Town, or other systems serving vulnerable kids. These weren't children growing up surrounded by powerful attorneys and parents with political connections. These were exactly the kinds of young people who, historically, predators have been able to exploit. Now, that does not mean their stories were automatically true. Being vulnerable doesn't make someone infallible. Trauma doesn't make somebody incapable of lying. And we're eventually going to spend a good amount of time talking about credibility, because credibility becomes one of the central battles in this case. But their backgrounds matter, because the basic allegation underneath all the crazier things that eventually get attached to Franklin wasn't supernatural. It wasn't satanic. It wasn't CIA mind control. The basic allegation was brutally ordinary. adults with money and influence were sexually exploiting vulnerable young people. Among the names that become central to the story are Alicia Owen, Paul Bonacci, and Troy Boner. And their stories don't remain perfectly aligned, and that matters too. Accounts change, people recant, people retract recantations. Some allegations become much larger over time. Eventually, we're going to encounter claims so extraordinary that I'm going to have to stop and say, okay, now you're going to need to show me a whole lot more than just somebody's word. But we're not there yet. So at this stage, allegations of child sexual exploitation had become serious enough that they were being folded into an official Nebraska legislative investigation. And this is one of those details that I think gets lost when Franklin is described today as simply an old conspiracy theory. Because that makes it sound like 30 years later, somebody found a grainy photograph on the internet, drew 6 red circles around it, and started a YouTube channel. And that's not how it happened. In January of 1989, the Nebraska legislature created a special Franklin committee. And look at what the legislature itself said it wanted examined. The failure of the credit union, obviously, but also the activities and responsibilities of the governor's office, the attorney general, social services, child protective services, the state foster care review board, county prosecutors, the Nebraska State Patrol, Omaha police, and, to the extent possible, federal agencies, including the FBI, IRS, U.S. Attorney, and the National Credit Union Administration. That is an extraordinary scope. And again, it doesn't prove anything. It doesn't prove that a sex ring existed, I should say. It proves the state legislature thought what was happening around Franklin warranted a serious investigation. The committee was chaired by State Senator Loren Schmidt. And another member was a man who becomes extremely important to the story, Ernie Chambers. Now, if you're not from Nebraska, chances are you don't know that name. Chambers was not some fringe figure who wandered into the state capitol carrying a folder, with the words, "The truth they don't want you to know," written on it. He was one of the most distinctive political figures Nebraska ever produced. A longtime senator from North Omaha, famously independent, combative, skeptical of authority, and not particularly interested in making powerful people comfortable. And Chambers had been hearing troubling allegations. The committee eventually hired a private investigator named Gary Caradori to pursue them. So remember that name. We're going to spend a lot of time with Gary Caradori later. For now, what matters is that Caradori began interviewing people who claimed they had either experienced or witnessed sexual exploitation involving Larry King and other prominent individuals. And this is where the story it starts becoming genuinely difficult to tell, because once you've read the later versions of Franklin, it's tempting to take everything those witnesses eventually alleged and dump it right here. But don't. That's exactly how you lose track of what the evidence actually says. At this stage, we have young people making serious allegations. We have legislators concerned enough to investigate. We have a private investigator interviewing witnesses. And we have accusations beginning to circulate involving people with wealth and influence in Omaha. That's enough for now. We don't need satanic altars. We don't need the CIA. We don't need the White House. Not yet. Because the allegations that were already on the table were serious enough on their own. And as Caradori and Legislative Committee pursued them, something else was happening at the same time. Law enforcement was investigating too. The FBI was involved. Local authorities were involved. A county grand jury would eventually be convened. So now you've got two tracks. One track, people connected to the legislative investigation becoming increasingly convinced there may be something very serious underneath these allegations. On the other track, law enforcement begins looking closely at the witnesses themselves. And those two tracks are about to arrive at radically different conclusions. Because in a relatively short period of time, Nebraska was going to go from, we may have uncovered a child sex abuse operation involving prominent people, to this entire thing is a hoax. And one of the young women making accusations is going to find herself not being treated as a victim, but as a defendant. So now we have to slow this down a little, because this is the point where Franklin stops being one story and becomes two. On one side, you've got members of the Nebraska legislature, Gary Caradori, and witnesses making increasingly serious allegations about sexual exploitation involving prominent people. And on the other side, you've got law enforcement looking at the same allegations and becoming increasingly convinced that the problem isn't a hidden sex ring. The problem is the witnesses. And in 1990, that second view becomes the official one. A Douglas County grand jury was convened to investigate the allegations, and when it finished, it didn't hedge. It didn't say the evidence was inconclusive. It didn't say there wasn't enough to prosecute. It decided that the entire thing was a carefully crafted hoax, to use their phrase. That is a hell of a phrase. And importantly, this wasn't the only official body to reach a similar conclusion. A federal grand jury investigating Franklin later would conclude that the stories of sexual abuse and drug trafficking were unfounded as well. Contemporary reporting from September of 1990 described the federal grand jury rejecting those allegations while continuing to pursue the very real financial crimes surrounding the credit union. And that distinction is important. The government never said nothing happened at Franklin. Clearly something happened at Franklin. Millions of dollars went missing. Larry King was facing serious federal charges. What investigators were saying was that the other Franklin story, the one about the organized exploitation of kids by prominent people, wasn't merely unproven. They believed it was false. And they thought some of the people telling it were lying under oath. That is a much stronger conclusion. Now, if I were making a conspiracy theory version of this episode, this would be the point where I'd tell you something like, well, of course the grand jury said it was a hoax. That's what a cover-up looks like. But that's circular reasoning. If every piece of evidence against your theory automatically becomes evidence for your theory, then you've built something that can't ever be tested. That's the nexus of a lot of conspiracy theories these days. So we need to take the grand jury conclusion seriously, and we're going to. But there's another reason I'm not ready to simply close the folder here at this point, and it's because the record also shows that some of the witnesses were telling different stories at different times, and sometimes they changed more than once. So we'll start with Troy Boner. Boner had originally described a child sex abuse ring to the investigator, Gary Caradori. Then, before the Douglas County grand jury, he recanted. He said the allegations were false. Okay, that is very significant. But according to testimony later described by the Nebraska Court of Appeals, Lauren Schmidt said Boner subsequently came to his office and told him something very, very different. Schmidt testified that Boner said his original account to Caradori had been true, and that he recanted before the grand jury because he'd been pressured by members of the FBI. Then Boner testified against Alicia Owen at her perjury trial. And after that trial, allegations surfaced that Boner said that he'd lied there too because of the fear and pressure. Now, does that prove the FBI threatened Troy Boner? No. The appellate court certainly didn't find that. Does it prove his original allegations were true? No. Again, what it proves is that by this point, trying to establish what Troy Boner actually believed or which version of his story was truthful was quickly becoming a nightmare. He had said one thing, then another, then allegedly said the second thing was false. And when your case involves claims this serious, that's devastating to your credibility. But it also leaves you with the question that runs through this entire story. Which lie are we talking about? Was the original accusation false? Was the recantation false? Was the later claim of pressure false? You don't get to pick whichever version best supports the story you already want to believe. You have to be able to prove it. And nowhere is that problem more important than with the young woman who became the most consequential Franklin accuser of all, Alicia Owen. Now, Owen didn't just accuse Larry King. Her allegations reached well beyond him and implicated other prominent people in Omaha. And eventually those allegations put her in the defendant's chair. Owen testified before the federal grand jury investigating Franklin. The grand jury concluded that she was lying, and she was indicted on 8 counts of perjury. In 1991, a jury convicted her on all 8. That is not some inconvenient footnote that we can wave away. If we're asking whether the broader Franklin story was real, Alicia Owen's conviction is one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the argument that it wasn't. And the later Nebraska appellate record gives us a window into why prosecutors believed her story had been manufactured. One figure who appears in that record is someone named Michael Casey. The Douglas County grand jury described Casey as a con man who presented himself as an investigative reporter trying to uncover the real Franklin story. And this is where things started to look very bad for Owen's credibility. While Owen was incarcerated on an unrelated bad check case, Casey was corresponding with her. A March 1990 letter discussed a Franklin media project and suggested that if Owen's information checked out, promises had been made concerning favorable treatment and protection outside of prison. Another message referred to interest from national publications, and a movie producer had told Owen she was assured of her work as a consultant or researcher after her release. So put yourself in prosecutor's shoes. You've got a witness making explosive allegations. You've got somebody around that witness discussing media projects and movie interest and employment and possible favorable treatment. And that's a serious credibility problem. It doesn't prove every word Owen said was false, but you cannot responsibly tell the Franklin story and pretend that this evidence doesn't exist. And then back comes into the picture Troy Boner again. At Owen's trial, Boner testified for the state. His position then was that the sexual abuse allegations he and Owen had made were false. And that obviously hurt her case enormously. But after the trial, Owen sought a new trial based partly on claims that Boner himself had admitted to lying. Her mother submitted an affidavit saying Boner called after the trial and said he had lied because of fear and pressure. Another affidavit alleged Boner's relatives had been told he accepted money in exchange for false testimony. Those allegations are in the appellate record. So is an audio recording of Boner's call with Owen's mother. But here's the other half. The Nebraska Court of Appeals did not accept that material as grounds for a new trial. The court noted that the issue of whether Boner had been coerced into lying had already been addressed during Owen's trial and concluded there was no justification for revisiting it. Owen's conviction stood. And there's yet another wrinkle. Jurors in Owen's case were instructed not to consume media coverage about Franklin. At least some of them did anyway. During deliberations, several jurors watched a 48 Hours segment dealing with the scandal, a segment that included Troy Boner saying he'd falsely accused prominent Omaha figures of sexual abuse. And again, that sounds awful for the integrity of the trial, but the appeals court looked into that too. Its conclusion was essentially that the program contained little the jury hadn't already heard during the trial, and it did not justify overturning the conviction. So where does that leave us? Not in a comfortable place, for sure, because if you're looking for evidence that Alicia Owen was unreliable, there's plenty of it here. She was convicted. There were questions about outside influences and possible incentives around her story. A key fellow accuser testified against her. Courts repeatedly declined to overturn the result. And all of that is substantial. However, if you're looking for reasons people continued to question how the Franklin allegations were handled, those exist too. A witness repeatedly changed his story. Claims of pressure were made. Jurors violated instructions and watched media coverage during deliberations. And people involved in the legislative investigation remained convinced the official account didn't explain everything. None of that erases Owen's conviction, and I want to be very clear about that. She was convicted of 8 counts of perjury. You cannot tell the story honestly without including that piece. But neither can you simply say, Alicia Owens lied, therefore the Franklin case is over. Because there was another accuser. And unlike Owen, his story didn't end with a perjury conviction. His name was Paul Bonacci. And Bonacci is where this case becomes even harder to put in a neat little box. Bonacci was another young man who had said Larry King had sexually abused him. But Bonacci's allegations went much further than that. He described being sexually exploited over a period of years. He alleged that King and others were involved in a broader network, and over time, his account grew to include some of the most extraordinary claims associated with Franklin. Some of those claims are exactly the kind of thing that make you stop and think, okay, no, wait a minute, slow down here, show me some evidence. And that's where Bonacci becomes difficult. Because if you only read material written by people who believe there was a Franklin cover-up, Bonacci is often presented as the witness who proves the whole thing. If you only read skeptical accounts, he's sometimes treated like the guy whose allegations became so bizarre that nothing he said deserves a second look. Neither approach is particularly useful. So here's what we can establish. In 1991, Bonacci filed a federal civil lawsuit against Larry King and several other people. King did not defend himself in the case. And I think that matters enormously because eventually a default judgment was entered against him. Now, you've probably seen this described online as Paul Bonacci proved in federal court that Larry King sexually abused him. And that wording is too strong. A default judgment means the defendant failed to respond or defend the case. It's not the same thing as a full trial in which both sides present evidence and cross-examine and call experts and challenge documents and ask a judge or a jury to decide who's telling the truth. In Bonacci's case, once King defaulted, the court held a hearing primarily just to determine damages. King wasn't even there, and no lawyer for King was there. The judge opened the proceeding by noting that a default had already been entered and that the purpose of the hearing was to decide the amount of damages. That's a pretty important procedural fact because when somebody says a federal judge heard all the evidence and ruled that the Franklin sex ring was real, that's not what happened. It's not an accurate description. The allegations against King were not tested in a normal trial setting. But, and here's where this refuses to become simple, the judge didn't merely have somebody type default onto a form and call it a bad day. Bonacci appeared and witnesses testified. The court heard evidence concerning the damages Bonacci claimed resulted from the alleged abuse. And in 1999, senior U.S. District Judge Warren Erbaum awarded Bonacci $1 million. $800,000 in compensatory damages, and another $200,000 in punitive damages. So no, it wasn't proof of the entire Franklin conspiracy, but it is also not accurate to pretend nothing happened in court. Something did. The careful way to say it is probably this. Bonacci won a $1 million civil judgment against Larry King after King defaulted and did not contest the allegations. And that is significant. It doesn't just establish everything Franklin believers sometimes claim it establishes, and Bonacci himself remained a very complicated witness. His accounts included allegations of severe and prolonged sexual abuse. They also eventually incorporated material involving satanic rituals, organized trafficking, intelligence operations, and other claims for which independent corroboration becomes increasingly difficult to find. Even Judge Erbaum, in earlier litigation involving Bonacci, had characterized portions of his testimony as bizarre. Now, that doesn't automatically mean Bonacci was lying, but people don't become incapable of being abused because they make other claims that sound unbelievable. That's a mistake I think we make far too easily. A witness can be truthful about one thing and wrong about another. A person can exaggerate. A person can misremember. A traumatized person can give inconsistent accounts. And also a person can just simply lie. The difficult part is figuring out which explanation fits which claim. And Bonacci's later civil case does something important to the Franklin story. It prevents us from saying the grand jury called the whole thing a hoax in 1990 and everybody admitted they lied and that was the end of the story. It wasn't. Bonacci kept making his allegations. He put them into a federal lawsuit and years later obtained a judgment against the central man he had accused. And again, it doesn't prove a nationwide trafficking network. It doesn't prove Washington involvement. It doesn't prove the satanic rituals part. It doesn't prove the government cover-up, but it does mean the historical record is messier than one sentence dismissal would suggest. And then, right in the middle of all of this, before the grand jury controversy had even finished playing itself out, the man hired by Nebraska lawmakers to investigate the allegations climbed into an airplane with his 8-year-old son, and neither of them came home. Gary Caradori was the private investigator from Lincoln, Nebraska. The legislative committee brought him in to investigate the Franklin allegations. And by the summer of 1990, he'd become one of the central figures pursuing the abuse claims. And this is where I need to tell the story very carefully, because there are two versions of Gary Caradori's death. There's what we can establish, and there's what decades of Franklin literature have built around it. So here's what we can establish. On July 11th, 1990, Gary Caradori was flying a small plane over Illinois. His 8-year-old son, AJ, was with him. The aircraft broke apart in flight, and both were killed. Investigators found wreckage scattered over a large area consistent with an in-flight breakup. And immediately, because of what Caradori had been investigating, people started asking whether this was really an accident. Of course they did. Imagine the circumstances. A private investigator is working allegations involving politically connected people and child sexual abuse, and he dies suddenly. Now, 10 years later, not after some unrelated illness, he and his young son die when his airplane comes apart in the sky. You don't need to be Alec Jones to ask what happened to that plane. And some people connected to the Nebraska investigation asked exactly that. Lauren Schmidt publicly raised the possibility that sabotage had to be considered. That much is documented. But, and this is the line that we can't cross, raising the possibility of sabotage is not finding sabotage. I was unable to find any reliable evidence establishing that Gary Caradori's aircraft was deliberately brought down. So I cannot confirm that he was murdered. And that's important because the Franklin version of the story often skips right over that distinction. Caradori dies while investigating Franklin. Therefore, Caradori was killed because he was investigating Franklin. Those are two entirely different propositions. The first is fact, and the second requires evidence. Now, there is another claim you will encounter almost immediately if you spend any time reading about Caradori. According to the cover-up narrative, he had just obtained explosive evidence. Depending on which version you're reading, that evidence included photographs, videotapes, recorded interviews, or material that would finally prove the sex ring. Then the plane crashed. And some of that evidence had supposedly disappeared. That is a hell of a story. It's also one I've had difficulty verifying to any standard I would need before telling you that it happened. There are accounts saying Caradori had obtained important material shortly before his death. There are later claims that certain evidence could not be located afterward. But the leap from that to evidence was stolen from the crash site because Caradori had proof of the conspiracy, well, obviously that's much larger than Franklin retelling sometimes acknowledge. So I'm going to give you the boring sentence, because the boring sentence is the honest sentence. I cannot confirm that evidence was stolen or deliberately removed from the Caradori crash scene. Could evidence have been lost? Of course. Could people have believed materials were missing? Absolutely. Does that prove somebody got to the wreckage and removed incriminating evidence? No. And there is something else worth noticing here. Gary Caradori's death doesn't need embellishment to be disturbing. A man was investigating horrific accusations. People connected to that investigation believed he was making progress. And then he and his 8-year-old son died when his aircraft broke apart mid-flight. That's already tragic and unusual. That's already enough to understand why suspicions exploded. We don't improve the story by pretending we know what caused the crash when we don't. And that's a theme we're going to keep running into. Because Franklin has an almost gravitational pull towards the most dramatic possible explanation. Sometimes the dramatic explanation might even be right, but might be right isn't the standard. So now we've got this extraordinary situation. Larry King is unquestionably involved in a massive financial misconduct. Young people have accused him and others of sexual abuse. One major accuser has been convicted of perjury. Another continues making allegations. It will eventually obtaining a civil judgment against King. A legislative investigator dies under odd circumstances, and people associated with the legislative investigation are deeply suspicious of what happened. Which brings us back to the phrase hanging over this entire story. The phrase carefully crafted hoax. Because now we know a little more about the people involved. It's time to ask what that conclusion actually meant, and whether the official explanation really accounts for everything that we've seen so far. So, if we're going to take the official conclusion of carefully crafted hoax seriously, and we should, we need to understand what authorities thought had actually happened. The Douglas County grand jury didn't simply say, we couldn't prove these allegations. It went much further. It said it found no credible evidence that Larry King or other Franklin officials had participated in a child sexual abuse ring, interstate transportation of minors, drug trafficking, or pornography operation. It concluded that the sensational Franklin story had been purely manufactured. And according to the later court record, the grand jury believed there were reasons some of these stories may have taken shape. People around the accusers were talking about books and television and movies and money, possible favorable treatment. There were witnesses who had made allegations and then recanted them. There were contradictions. There were stories that became more elaborate. And investigators clearly came to believe that some people were reinforcing one another's accounts rather than independently describing the same events. And those are not trivial problems. If you're asking me whether there is a legitimate evidentiary base for skepticism about the Franklin allegations, the sex ring allegations, absolutely, there is. You don't need to invent one. And then the federal grand jury came along a couple of months later and reached essentially the same bottom line conclusion. It found the sexual abuse and trafficking allegations unfounded. So now you've got two grand juries, state and federal, both rejecting the central conspiracy allegation, and that carries weight, as it should. But here's where I start having trouble with the phrase carefully crafted hoax, because that's a very specific explanation. A hoax isn't simply a mistaken allegation. A hoax is something constructed. Someone or several someones deliberately creates the story. And according to contemporary reporting, the Douglas County grand jury itself said this hoax appeared to have been scripted by a person or people with considerable knowledge of Omaha's institutions and prominent citizens. Okay, who? That's where the answer gets fuzzier. The grand jury discussed people it believed had helped fuel rumors and encouraged allegations. It raised suspicions about motives, but it did not identify anybody as the mastermind and demonstrate, here is the person who invented the Franklin sex ring. Here's how they recruited witnesses. Here's how the stories were coordinated. Here's the evidence showing the fabrication from beginning to end. And that's part of why the phrase leaves such a strange aftertaste, I think. If you tell me you've discovered a carefully crafted hoax, I naturally expect some information about who crafted it. Now, it not being there, I guess, doesn't mean there wasn't a hoax. Investigators don't have to identify the author of every false story before determining that the story itself isn't credible. But it helps explain why some people who had been close to the legislative investigation weren't satisfied. Lauren Schmidt certainly wasn't satisfied. When the Douglas County report came out, Schmidt called it a strange document and then added, "That is the kindest thing I can say about it." Now, that's not proof of a cover-up. Schmidt had invested a lot of time and political capital in the legislative investigation. He had reasons to believe the allegations deserved to be pursued. He could simply have been wrong. That is possible. But his reaction matters because he wasn't commenting from 30 years away with the podcast microphone and 20 browser tabs open. He was chairing the legislative committee investigating Franklin while this was happening. And here's another important point. When the county grand jury announced that the whole thing was a hoax, the federal investigation was still going on. So even at that moment, there wasn't one unified government voice saying case closed. There were different investigations moving on different tracks. Eventually, the federal grand jury also rejected the abuse allegations, but the disagreement between the legislative investigations and the criminal investigations never really went away, never disappeared. And Franklin believers look at that disagreement and say, see there, that's the cover-up. And I don't think the evidence gets us there. Institutional disagreement isn't proof of corruption. Investigators can look at the same witness and reach different conclusions, and legislators can become convinced of something prosecutors don't believe they can prove. Law enforcement can be right. Law enforcement can also screw up. None of those possibilities require a secret cabal. But there's another trap here on the skeptical side. You also can't say two grand juries rejected the allegations, therefore every unanswered question is meaningless. That's not how evidence works either. The grand jury findings deserved substantial weight. Owen's conviction deserves substantial weight. The recantations deserve substantial weight, but none of those things magically transforms every disputed event in the Franklin record into pure nonsense. And this is where I think the two camps really lose each other. The conspiracy camp looks at anything suspicious and says proof. The debunking camp looks at the grand jury reports and says that's finished. And honestly, I'm not comfortable doing either, because now we have to deal with the part of Franklin that made the story national in the first place, Washington. And that is where I was especially interested in what that animated reel was showing me, because right at the beginning, it gave us Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, and they're having a conversation, and the implication couldn't have been clearer. So I went to see if there was any evidence to that, and what I found was actually interesting, just not in the way the reel was presenting it. So let's start with the easiest part. Did Larry King have legitimate connections to national Republican politics? Yes. We've already established that. He wasn't imagining his way into Republican events. He held positions in black Republican organizations, participated in inaugural activities, and had enough standing that members of Congress recommended him for a presidential appointment. So when Franklin witnesses began talking about Washington, the idea that Larry King could physically get himself into political circles was realistic. He had access. But again, access is not evidence of abuse. Then we come to something that makes the Franklin story even stranger. Because while all of this is happening in Omaha, Washington really did have a separate sex scandal involving politically connected people. The central name there was Craig Spence. Spence was a Washington lobbyist and well-connected party host. He moved among journalists and military people and diplomats and government officials, and in 1989, his name became tied to an investigation involving a male escort service operating in Washington. That part is real. Police and Secret Service investigated the escort operation. People connected to it ultimately faced criminal charges. And Spence was identified as one of its major customers. Then came the detail that made the story explode. Craig Spence had arranged late-night tours of the White House. Also real. A uniformed Secret Service officer helped Spence and his guests enter public areas of the White House after hours. That officer acknowledged accepting an expensive Rolex from Spence. The Secret Service investigated. So now imagine encountering all of this in 1989. In Omaha, you've got allegations that young people were being sexually exploited by politically connected adults. In Washington, you've got an actual male prostitution investigation involving a lobbyist with politically connected friends who had managed to arrange after-hours White House tours. You can see how people would start drawing lines. I mean, I can see how people start drawing lines, but that's exactly when we need to be careful, because contemporary reporting also found something important. Investigators said they had not found evidence that high-ranking Reagan or Bush administration officials were customers of the escort service. They had not established a blackmail operation involving senior government officials. And later reporting cast doubt on some of the more sensational claims about prostitutes being brought into the White House. So there was a real scandal. There really were late-night White House tours. There really was a Secret Service problem. There really was a male escort operation. But the most explosive political version of the story outran what the investigators could establish. Sound familiar? And now comes the Franklin question. Was Craig Spence actually connected in some way to the Franklin operation? This is where the evidence gets much thinner. There are Franklin witnesses and later authors who try to connect those two stories. There are claims involving trips to Washington. There are claims involving political figures, claims involving locations associated with Spence. But nothing I've been able to find gives strong independent evidence establishing that the Omaha allegations and Craig Spence and his escort scandal were parts of some coordinated operation. That's a crucial distinction. Two strange sex scandals can happen during the same period without being the same sex scandal. Of course they can. And the White House question, well, same rule. There are allegations that young people associated with Franklin were taken to Washington. There are allegations involving political figures. Paul Bonacci later made extraordinary claims about what happened there. But I have not been able to find any evidence that allows me to tell you that Ronald Reagan had any direct connection to Franklin, as far as the malfeasance is concerned. I have not found evidence that allows me to tell you George H.W. Bush did either. I've not seen any evidence that either president knew about Franklin trafficking operation and helped cover it up. So that animated conversation between Reagan and Bush in that video that first caught my attention appears to be pure fiction, storytelling, not evidence. And frankly, I think putting Reagan and Bush on the screen like that actually makes the real story harder to understand. It makes the video get more views, I guess, but it makes the story harder to understand. Because you don't need fictionalized presidents whispering in a dark room to make this story interesting. At least I don't think so. The documented story is strange enough. Larry King really had Washington political access. Craig Spence really was involved in a separate Washington sex scandal. Spence really did have enough access to arrange late-night White House tours. A Secret Service officer really was investigated over his relationship to Spence. All of those facts are true and fascinating, but then you got to stop, because once you move from these things happened to therefore they were all connected, you need evidence connecting them, and that's the evidence that I've never been able to see. This is also the point where Franklin begins expanding outward in every direction. Washington becomes intelligence agencies. Political access becomes blackmail. Sexual abuse allegations becomes satanic ritual abuse. A plane crash becomes an assassination. Missing children get folded into the story. Iran-Contra enters the picture. CIA enters the picture. And eventually you reach a point where almost every dark secret of the 1980s seems to have been connected to Franklin by someone. Which means this is probably a good place for me to say, okay, now I'm reaching for the brakes. Because this is where the Franklin story starts becoming something else. Once the basic allegations of sexual exploitation were out there, other claims started flying in. The satanic rituals and the CIA operations and Iran-Contra, blackmail, murder, missing kids, nationwide trafficking networks. And eventually, if you spend enough time in Franklin material, you start getting the feeling that every dark story from the 1980s was getting sucked in. A major reason for that is someone by the name of John DeCamp. DeCamp was a former Nebraska state senator who became one of the most important advocates for the cover-up interpretation. In 1992, he published a book with the title that doesn't exactly bury the lead. The Franklin Cover-Up: Child Abuse, Satanism, and Murder in Nebraska. And DeCamp's version of Franklin is enormous. He connects the credit union scandal to child trafficking, political corruption, ritual abuse, Iran-Contra, and suspicious deaths. He argues that the official investigations weren't merely wrong, that they were part of the cover-up. And here's where I start reaching for the brakes, because some of DeCamp's material comes from real events. Some comes from real witnesses. Some comes from documented government records. But once those pieces are assembled into one gigantic explanatory system, the evidence gets much weaker. For instance, you'll encounter claims that numerous people connected to Franklin died suspiciously. Sometimes you'll see a number, 12, 15 more. But before I repeat something like 15 people connected to Franklin were mysteriously killed, I want to know, who are the 15? How directly were they connected? How did each one die? Was there evidence of foul play? Or are we counting every person who ever touched this story and later died? Because a list of dead people is not evidence of murder. And then there's the satanic ritual abuse. People of the period we're talking about, the late 80s and early 90s were the height of what became known as the satanic panic. Across the country, extraordinary allegations were being made about secret ritual abuse networks, and some led to prosecutions, some later collapsed, some produced wrongful convictions. So when Franklin expands into stories of ritual murder and satanic ceremonies, that historical context needs to be taken into consideration. But I want to be careful in the opposite direction too, because there's another mistake. The satanic stuff sounds crazy, therefore nobody was sexually abused. You can't make a statement like that. That doesn't follow either. A person can make an unsupported, extraordinary allegation and still have experienced ordinary, very real abuse. A story can accumulate exaggerations around a genuine event, or the whole thing can be false. Again, claim by claim, evidence by evidence. That's the only way to get through something like this. Same goes for the CIA and the Iran-Contra connections. The same goes for attempts to connect Franklin to the disappearance of Iowa paperboy Johnny Gosch. I could spend another hour taking you through all of those different branches, easily another hour, but we would very quickly stop doing an episode about the Franklin scandal and start doing a guided tour of American conspiracy culture. That's not what I wanted to know when I started this. I wanted to know whether underneath all of this, underneath the Satanism and the intelligence agencies and the assassinations and the White House stories, was there something real? And there's one modern case that makes that question harder to dismiss than it might once have been. And of course, that's Jeffrey Epstein. Now, let me say this as clearly as I possibly can. Jeffrey Epstein does not prove Franklin. None of it. None of it. If someone says Epstein was real, therefore Franklin was real, that's nonsense. It's terrible reasoning. But Epstein changed something else. He changed what we can reasonably call impossible. Think about the basic proposition. A wealthy man sexually exploits underage girls. He builds a network around himself. Other people help recruit victims. He has extraordinary social access. He spends time around politicians and businessmen and academics and celebrities. And despite allegations and investigations, the conduct continues for years. Federal prosecutors eventually alleged that Epstein had created a network of underage victims, some as young as 14, and that employees and associates helped facilitate his access to them. Now, again, that is Epstein, not Franklin, but Epstein permanently destroyed one argument that used to be made very casually about stories like Franklin. Come on, something that big couldn't happen. Too many people would know. Well, we've learned that powerful people can operate in environments where a lot of people know pieces, where institutions fail, where victims aren't believed, where money and social standing buy enormous amounts of insulation. That doesn't make Franklin true. It means the phrase "that could never happen" is not evidence that Franklin was false. Plausibility and proof are different things, and that's really where I land after spending all this time inside the Franklin files, because this story keeps punishing you whenever you confuse the two. So, was there a Franklin cover-up? I can't tell you that. Not responsibly. I can tell you considerably more than I could when the animated reel first landed in front of me. Larry King ran the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union. Tens of millions of dollars disappeared. King was politically connected. He moved in national Republican circles and had legitimate political access. Young people accused King and other prominent adults of sexually exploiting them. Those allegations were absolutely made. Nebraska legislators took them seriously enough to investigate. Gary Caradori was hired to investigate those allegations, and he and his 8-year-old son died when their airplane broke apart in flight. Now, was he assassinated? Can't confirm that. Did somebody steal evidence from the records? Can't confirm that. Alicia Owens accused prominent people of sexual abuse. She was later convicted on 8 counts of federal perjury. That's real. There are troubling details around witnesses changing stories and allegations of pressure, also real. Do those things erase Owen's conviction? No. Paul Bonacci continued accusing Larry King. Years later, he obtained a $1 million civil judgment against him. That is real. Did that federal case prove a nationwide Franklin sex ring? No. State and federal grand juries investigated the broader allegations and rejected them. That is real. The Douglas County grand jury called the story a carefully crafted hoax. That was real. Did everyone involved in the Nebraska legislative investigation accept that conclusion? No. Larry King had Washington connections. Craig Spence really did become involved in separate Washington escort scandal. And he did give improper after-hours tours. But was there an actual connection to Reagan or Bush? No. So we want a verdict, and we want Franklin to fit into a box, hoax or cover up, and pick one. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe there were false or exaggerated claims mixed together with genuine abuse. Maybe vulnerable people experienced terrible things and had nothing to do with the enormous network later described. Maybe investigators became convinced witnesses were lying and then stopped looking seriously at allegations that deserved further examination. Maybe legislative investigators became so convinced something terrible had happened that they gave questionable witnesses too much credibility. Maybe grand juries were substantially right, and the Franklin sex ring theory was constructed out of rumor, unreliable witnesses, and people feeding off one another. I don't know. And after looking at this case, I don't think anybody earns credibility by pretending that we know more than the evidence allows. But I don't think crazy conspiracy theory is an adequate description of Franklin, because underneath the conspiracy theory is a real financial crime and real political access, real accusations, real disagreement between investigators, real perjury prosecution, real dead investigator, and enough unanswered or disputed questions to explain why this story still survives. What I don't think we're entitled to is to take those unanswered questions and fill in whatever conclusion scares us the most. That's not how a story like Franklin becomes almost impossible to understand. Real corruption attracts rumors. False allegations can attract themselves to real misconduct. Victims can be imperfect witnesses. Witnesses can lie. And the reasons go on and on. Many things can be true at the same time. Which, of course, leaves me with much less exciting rule than the one in the animated reel, but probably the more useful one. Believe what the evidence earns. Question what deserves questioning, and don't confuse suspicion with proof. Don't confuse an official conclusion with permission to stop asking questions either. Because 40 years later, I still don't think the Franklin file gives us a clean answer. I think it gives us something messier, a real scandal, disputed set of allegations, pile of contradictions, a mythology that grew far beyond what can be proven, and somewhere inside of all of it, maybe, a truth nobody ever managed to completely sort out. And for one, I think, I don't know, maybe the most honest ending that we've got. All right, everyone, thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this Back Porch Files edition from your neighbor on the left. I want to mention that, particularly in this case, I want to remind you that there will be a blog post on the website with all the sources that I used for this episode. So stop on by and check those out if you have any questions about where I got my information from. It's Friday, and the weekend is here, so do me a favor. Stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of weekend you'd wish for others.